Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, join me for a brief presentation. $2.99.
A single number began the decline of an empire. This moment could have been a triumph, and not the beginning of the end of Sega's home console business. In order to understand this moment in time, you have to understand what Sony had gone through to achieve this goal. The Sony PlayStation was a concept that owed its genesis from an agreement between Sony and Nintendo. Sony supplied the sound chips to Nintendo for the SNES. The deal proved extremely profitable for Sony, and it motivated Sony to consider entering the video game industry as more than just a hardware supplier, but only they didn't want to go it alone. The deal Sony made with Nintendo was that they were going to make the CD attachment for the SNES. Sony and Nintendo had negotiated the deal for the system, and Sony even went as far as announcing the hardware. However, at the conference where Nintendo announced their end of the deal with Sony, Nintendo announced they were partnering with Philips to create a CD add-on. Sony was publicly humiliated by the event. Nintendo and Sony had never formally ratified the contract, and Nintendo chose to back out of the deal because Sony wanted an unfavorable license agreement. The deal gave Sony practically complete control of any CD produced for their joint system, which that deal would have given Sony an incredibly easy entrance into the video game industry. Nintendo, realizing that they could inadvertently create an enormous rival overnight, nixed the deal and publicly humiliated Sony in an effort to keep them out of the video game industry, any more than they already were. The one thing Nintendo didn't count on was the determination of Sony's Western divisions, and Ken Kutaragi. Olaf Olvesson, the head of Sony Interactive, was one of the individuals from Sony present at the Nintendo press conference. He was taken by complete surprise by Nintendo's unexpected change of heart, but he wasn't the type to take this moment as defeat, but yet another opportunity.
Sony came to us after they had been rebuffed by Nintendo. They had wanted Nintendo to use some technology that they had, and Nintendo instead chose to work with Philips. That really annoyed Sony. Olaf Olofsson and Mickey Schulhoff came to my office and said, "Tom, we really don't like Nintendo. You don't like Nintendo. We have this studio down in Santa Monica working on video games. We don't know what to do with it. We'd like Sega's help in training our guys, and we think the optical disc will be the best format."
Sony of Japan was hesitant to try entering the video game industry on their own, especially after their humiliation at the hands of Nintendo. Sony of Japan was willing to just stay out of the video game industry as a main player, but elements within Sony were working towards creating a system Sony could push to market. The Western elements of Sony, namely Olaf Olvesson, saw a path that would allow Sony a way to strike back at Nintendo and gain a potential business partner along the way.
Well, I agreed with them. I thought CDs would be the next format as well, but in those days nobody knew how to program on optical discs. So I said, okay, let's combine our efforts. Let's finance ImageSoft, and let's finance this little developer called Digital Pictures, which seemed to be the furthest along in knowing how to program on optical discs. And they financed 3 titles from Digital Pictures, and we did as well.
Sega and Sony began working together with creating games for the Sega CD, which both companies agreed would use the format of choice for the next generation of consoles. Sega and Sony worked together with Digital Pictures, a company that had begun making full-motion video-type games for the Hasbro Nemo, which was an ill-fated video system that Hasbro never brought to market. So the games Digital Pictures had made actually sat in a warehouse waiting for a console capable of playing them. Notably, the titles were Night Trap, Sewer Shark, Ground Zero Texas, Double Switch, and the Make a Music Video series of games. These titles were split between Sega and Sony, who each used these to better understand CDs as a format for game creation and distribution.
So our relationship with Sony was very close and very tight. We together worked a lot of these things out, and Sega of America and Sony were both convinced that the next platform had to use optical discs. We had been working on the CD-ROM attachment to the Genesis, which we knew really wasn't adequate, but it taught us how to make games on this format.
Sega of America and Sony had grown close with the work they'd done together on the Sega CD. Despite that the titles they produced together were FMV titles, it did a lot in teaching both Sony and Sega about what the next generation system would need in order to take advantage of the future titles to be developed. However, there were 2 different schools of thought that began to emerge from Sony and Sega working together. Sega of America and Sony started to see that the next generation of gaming would be more 3D based in presentation. Sega of Japan, however, saw the future differently. The design team in Japan had built a powerhouse system based around 2D graphics, this being the first design of the Sega Saturn, which was, at least initially in design, primarily focused on 2D games. Sega of America and Sony wanted to move forward with something that they knew would be a game-changing system, and they needed Sega of Japan to be on board with the endeavor.
We had the Sony guys and our engineers in the United States come up with specs for what this next optical-based hardware system would be. And with these specs, all of a sudden Sholoff and I went to Japan and we met with Sony's Ken Kutaragi. He said it was a great idea, and as we all lose money on hardware, let's jointly market a single system, the Sega Sony hardware system, and whatever loss we make, we split that loss.
Tom Kalinske was strongly in favor of the deal Sony was offering. He would basically share the cost of research and development, and they would split any potential loss on the production of hardware. And Sony and Sega would keep all the profits on the games they produced to themselves. The deal was quite possibly a win-win for Sega, given that Sega had a history of making not only arcade hit titles, but had some of the best home console games ever produced. So Sega had a surefire way of making money off this deal, with only half the potential loss.
Next we went to Nakayama and the board at Sega, and they basically turned me down. They said, "That's a stupid idea. Sony doesn't know how to make hardware. They don't know how to make software either. Why would we want to do this?" That is what caused the division between Sega and Sony and caused Sony to become our competitor and launch its own hardware platform.
The deal was rejected by Sega of Japan, who notably had the same reactionary response to Sony that Nintendo had. Sega of Japan saw this partnership as a threat, and could have given Sony easy access into the video game industry. However, what Sega of Japan failed to consider was that Sony was a force of nature in terms of resources. True, other tech giants like NEC had tried and failed to enter the gaming industry, but what NEC didn't have was people like Steve Race and Olaf Olsson, individuals who had a keen knowledge of business and the gaming industry. Sega could have taken advantage of this relationship, but chose not to, because of their pride in their own achievements in the gaming industry. However, Sega of Japan failed to trust Tom Kalinske, the person responsible for much of Sega's success in North America. Sega had an opportunity to tame a giant, a force that could have given them the backing to dominate the gaming industry. However, they chose their own path. The rivalry with Sony produced some notable systems. However, what Sony learned from their brief partnership with Sega gave them the weapons they needed to dominate the console wars. Thank you for watching The Historic Nerd today. If you enjoyed this content, please go over and check out Yahel's from Wrestle with Gaming's content. He makes video game retrospectives in a similar fashion to how I do. And he was kind enough to lend his voice talents as Tom Kalinske for this episode. If you enjoy gaming-based content, I highly suggest you go over and check out theconsoleexplosion.com. There's a number of talented content creators there that you might enjoy. But yeah, if you want to get in touch with me, feel free to contact me at HistoricalNerd on Twitter.com. I typically respond. And yeah, there's a Facebook page, so whatever you want to do there. So thanks for dropping by and watching. Hope you have a wonderful day, evening, night, or whatever it is you're doing. Bye.